Marcus Thompson had always prided himself on being prepared for anything, but as he stood in the abandoned gas station on Route 47, watching the news broadcast flicker on the cracked television screen, he realized that no amount of emergency preparedness could have readied him for this nightmare. The reporter's voice trembled as she described the unprecedented viral outbreak spreading across major cities, but Marcus knew the sanitized language was just another lie from people who refused to face the truth. He'd seen the real footage on social media before the internet went dark 3 hours ago. Videos of people tearing into each other with their bare teeth, moving with an unnatural hunger that made his blood run cold. The gas station's owner, an elderly man named Frank Kowalski, sat behind the counter with his hunting rifle across his lap, his weathered hands shaking as he methodically loaded shells into the chamber. Outside, the small town of Millbrook seemed eerily quiet, but Marcus could hear something in the distance that didn't belong, a low, collective moan that seemed to drift on the wind like a funeral dirge. Rebecca Martinez burst through the front door, her scrubs still splattered with blood from her shift at Millbrook General Hospital, her dark eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from witnessing the impossible firsthand. She'd driven straight from the hospital after watching her colleague Dr. Patterson get torn apart by what used to be Mrs. Henderson from the retirement home, and the image was burned into her retinas like a brand. "They're not sick," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper as she locked the door behind her. "Whatever this is, they're not sick, there's something else entirely." Marcus felt his stomach drop as Rebecca described how the infected had overrun the hospital in less than 20 minutes, moving with a coordination that suggested something far more sinister than a simple virus. Frank's radio crackled to life with an emergency broadcast that confirmed their worst fears. The military was implementing a complete quarantine of the tri-state area, and anyone caught trying to leave would be considered a threat to national security. The sound of screeching tires drew their attention to the parking lot, where a battered pickup truck slammed into the gas pumps with a shower of sparks that made all three of them duck for cover. Two figures stumbled out of the vehicle, a teenage girl with blonde hair matted with dirt and tears, and a middle-aged man in a torn business suit who moved with the careful precision of someone trying to hold himself together through sheer willpower. The girl, who introduced herself as Emma Carlson, explained through chattering teeth that her entire family had been killed when their neighbors turned violent without warning, and she'd only escaped because her father had thrown himself between her and the attackers. The man, David David Williams, Rebecca corrected herself, was an insurance adjuster who'd been driving home from work when his entire neighborhood had erupted into chaos, forcing him to abandon his car and run for his life through the woods. As the 5 survivors shared their stories, a terrible picture began to emerge. This wasn't just happening in Millbrook, but everywhere simultaneously, as if some invisible switch had been flipped that turned ordinary people into ravenous predators. Marcus realized that they were probably among the last unaffected people in a 100-mile radius, and the weight of that knowledge settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The emergency broadcast continued to repeat its warnings about staying indoors and avoiding contact with anyone showing signs of aggressive behavior, but Marcus knew that advice was useless now. They were past the point of hiding and waiting for rescue. Frank's police scanner picked up fragmentary transmissions from law enforcement units that painted a picture of complete societal collapse. Hospitals overrun, police stations abandoned, and military units going dark one by one as the infection spread through their ranks like wildfire. When the lights in the gas station suddenly flickered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the pale glow of Frank's emergency radio, Marcus felt something shift inside him. A transformation from ordinary citizen to reluctant leader that would define everything that came next. The moaning sound outside was getting closer now, and through the grimy windows, they could see shapes moving in the moonlight with the jerky, unnatural gait of things that were no longer entirely human. Rebecca checked her medical supplies while Emma clutched a baseball bat she'd found behind the counter, and David methodically inventoried the food and water available in the store. They all understood without speaking that their old lives had ended the moment the first scream echoed through their quiet town, and whatever came next would demand everything they had to give, and probably more than they thought they possessed. The infected arrived with the dawn, shambling across the parking lot in a grotesque parade that made Marcus's throat constrict with primal fear. From their position behind the overturned magazine rack, he counted at least 20 figures moving with that distinctive jerky gait that had haunted his nightmares for the past 6 hours. Frank's hands had stopped shaking once he'd found his purpose, methodically checking the sight on his hunting rifle while whispering calculations about ammunition and kill shots that revealed a military background he'd never mentioned. Rebecca crouched beside the pharmacy section she transformed into a makeshift medical station, her nurse's training kicking in as she prepared bandages and antiseptic for what was surely coming. The infected moved without coordination yet somehow maintained a shared purpose, like iron filings drawn to a magnet, and that terrible unity made Marcus realize they were facing something that defied every assumption about human behavior. Emma pressed herself against the window, her young face set in lines too hard for someone who should have been worried about college applications instead of survival, and Marcus felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. She'd barely spoken since her arrival, but her eyes held a determination that reminded him of his sister at that age, stubborn, fierce, and utterly unwilling to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. David had positioned himself near the back exit, his insurance adjuster's mind calculating risks and escape routes with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to property damage assessments. The transformation in all of them was remarkable and terrifying. Ordinary people discovering capabilities they'd never known they possessed because the alternative was simply unthinkable. The first infected to reach the door had once been someone's grandmother, her floral house dress torn and stained with substances Marcus didn't want to identify, but her eyes held nothing human anymore, just an endless, gnawing hunger that made his skin crawl. Frank's rifle cracked once and the figure dropped, but 3 more immediately took her place, pressing against the reinforced glass with enough force to make the entire frame shudder. Marcus found himself shouting orders without conscious thought, directing Emma to secure the side windows while David checked their rear defenses, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep inside him. Rebecca called out observations about the infected's behavior patterns, noting how they seemed drawn to sound and movement but appeared to have no memory of their former lives, and her clinical detachment in the face of horror helped anchor the group's resolve. The siege lasted 14 hours, wave after wave of infected testing every barrier they'd constructed while the survivors learned hard lessons about resource management and psychological endurance. Marcus discovered that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about making decisions when every option seemed wrong and taking responsibility for the consequences. When their barricades began to fail around midnight, he made the call to abandon the front of the store and retreat to the storage room, a decision that probably saved their lives but felt like personal failure. Rebecca proved that medical training extended far beyond treating injuries. Her understanding of anatomy helped them identify the infected's weak points, and her steady hands never wavered even when Frank's ammunition began running low and they had to resort to improvised weapons. Emma's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The terrified teenager who'd stumbled into their lives became a fierce defender who wielded her baseball bat with calculated precision that spoke to untapped reservoirs of strength. David's methodical nature, which had probably made him an excellent insurance adjuster, proved invaluable for maintaining their supplies and planning their defensive positions, but it was his quiet courage during the worst moments that truly revealed his character. Frank fought like someone who'd been waiting his whole life for a battle that mattered, and his military experience became the foundation that kept them alive when everything seemed lost. As the sun rose on their second day in the gas station, the infected had moved on in search of easier prey, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would have broken them 24 hours earlier but now felt like victory. Marcus looked around at his companions, bloodied, exhausted, forever changed by what they'd endured together, and realized they were no longer the same people who'd sought shelter in this place. They'd become something new, something harder and more resilient, forged by necessity into the kind of people who could survive in a world gone mad. Rebecca was already planning their next move, studying maps and calculating distances to potential safe zones, while Emma and David inventoried their remaining supplies with the efficiency of seasoned survivors. The gas station had been their crucible, and they'd emerged from it transformed, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them on the road ahead. The highway stretched before them like a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams, littered with abandoned vehicles that told stories Marcus didn't want to imagine. Their stolen pickup truck, Frank had insisted it wasn't really stealing when the original owner was probably dead, weaved between the automotive carnage while Rebecca navigated using a paper map she'd found in the gas station's office. The GPS satellites had gone silent 12 hours ago, along with most radio stations, leaving them to navigate by landmarks and hope in a world that seemed determined to crush both. Frank drove with the steady concentration of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize horror, his weathered hands gripping the wheel while his eyes constantly scanned for threats that could emerge from any direction without warning. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her baseball bat within easy reach and her young face set in lines that spoke of experiences no teenager should carry, while David and Marcus shared the truck bed with their salvage supplies and weapons. The morning air carried the acrid smell of distant fires and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that Rebecca had identified as the stench of decay from the massive die-off that had occurred when the infection first struck. They'd been driving for 3 hours when they encountered their first roadblock. A overturned school bus surrounded by dozens of infected who seemed to be drawn to something inside the vehicle, their moans creating a discordant symphony that made Marcus's teeth ache. The sound of children crying from within the bus made the decision for all of them, despite the tactical nightmare of engaging so many infected in open terrain. Marcus found himself issuing orders with the calm authority of someone who'd accepted that impossible situations required impossible solutions, coordinating their approach while Frank positioned the truck for both attack and rapid escape. Rebecca had discovered that headshots weren't always necessary. Severe trauma to the brainstem could drop an infected just as effectively, and this knowledge had already saved them precious ammunition during their escape from the gas station. The rescue operation became a brutal dance of calculated violence and desperate courage that left them all shaking but victorious. Jake Morrison emerged from the bus like something from a war movie, a former Marine whose muscular frame bore fresh scars and whose intense blue eyes held the kind of focus that came from extensive combat experience. He'd been traveling with Lisa Park, an elementary school teacher whose protective instincts had kept 3 children alive through 48 hours of absolute hell, and his military training had proved invaluable in turning the overturned bus into a temporary fortress. The children, twin brothers named Tyler and Connor Walsh, both around 8 years old, and a 10-year-old girl named Zoe Martinez, had survived by following Lisa's instructions with the kind of discipline that spoke to her abilities as an educator and their trust in her guidance. The expanded group's dynamics shifted immediately as resources that had seemed adequate for 5 people suddenly needed to stretch to accommodate 8, and Marcus watched carefully as personalities began to clash under the pressure of scarcity. Jake's military background made him naturally assume a leadership role that conflicted with Marcus's emerging authority, while Lisa's protective instincts for the children sometimes conflicted with the hard choices their survival required. Rebecca found herself mediating between competing viewpoints while Emma struggled with the sudden presence of children who reminded her too painfully of the family she'd lost. Their destination was a rumored safe zone near the abandoned Riverside Mall, supposedly established by National Guard units who'd gone rogue to protect civilian populations, but every mile revealed new horrors that tested their resolve. David's insurance background had taught him to assess risk, and his growing unease about their situation proved prescient when they discovered that several other survivor groups were converging on the same location, creating competition for resources and sanctuary that could turn deadly without warning. The children's presence complicated every decision from route planning to engagement protocols, but also provided something precious that had been missing from their group: hope for a future beyond mere survival. As they approached the final checkpoint before the supposed safe zone, Marcus realized that their journey had transformed them all in ways that went far beyond simple survival skills. Jake's military expertise had merged with Frank's practical knowledge and Rebecca's medical training to create a formidable team, while Lisa's ability to maintain hope and humanity in impossible circumstances had become their emotional anchor. Emma had evolved from traumatized teenager to fierce protector, and David's methodical nature had proved essential for long-term planning and resource management. The infected had taken everything they'd once considered normal, but in return had forged them into something stronger. Ordinary people discovering that extraordinary circumstances could reveal extraordinary capabilities they'd never known they possessed. The Riverside Mall had once been a monument to suburban prosperity, but now its shattered storefronts and blood-stained corridors served as a fortress for survivors who'd learned that the living could be far more dangerous than the dead. Marcus felt his optimism crumble as they approached the heavily fortified entrance, where armed guards in mismatched tactical gear scrutinized their group with the cold calculation of people who'd made peace with violence as a survival tool. The supposed National Guard checkpoint had been replaced by something far more sinister: a militaristic organization that called itself the New Order Coalition, led by a charismatic former police captain named Robert Sterling whose silver tongue and dead eyes reminded Marcus of every corrupt politician he'd ever despised. Sterling's welcome seemed genuine enough, complete with promises of hot meals, medical supplies and secure sleeping quarters, but Rebecca noticed immediately that the other survivors in the mall moved with the nervous energy of people living under constant threat. Lisa kept the children close as they were processed through what Sterling called orientation, but which felt more like interrogation as armed guards catalogued their supplies and weapons with an efficiency that suggested this routine had been perfected through repetition. Jake's military instincts were screaming warnings that Marcus wished he'd heeded, but the exhaustion of constant vigilance and the children's desperate need for safety had clouded his judgment in ways that would prove catastrophic. The betrayal came during their third night, when Marcus woke to find David standing over Frank's bunk with a knife in his hand and tears streaming down his face. The insurance adjuster's methodical nature had made him an ideal recruit for Sterling's inner circle, and his access to their group's trust had provided intelligence about their capabilities and resources that the coalition valued highly. Frank died quietly, his military training failing him in the face of treachery from someone he'd considered family, and the old man's final expression held more disappointment than fear. David's confession came in broken whispers. His real family was being held hostage by Sterling's people, and he'd been forced to choose between the group that had saved his life and the wife and daughter who represented everything he'd lost when the world ended. The night erupted into chaos as Sterling's forces moved to secure what they called recruitment candidates and excess resources, military euphemisms that couldn't disguise their intent to enslave the strong and eliminate the inconvenient. Rebecca found herself separated from the others during the initial assault, her medical skills marking her as valuable enough to warrant special handling, while Emma fought like a cornered wildcat to protect the children from guards who saw them as either future soldiers or current liabilities. Jake's combat experience kept him alive long enough to reach the emergency exits, but Lisa took a bullet protecting Tyler and Connor, her teacher's instincts overriding survival as she threw herself between the children and their attackers. Marcus discovered leadership meant making impossible choices when he realized they couldn't save everyone and still escape with their lives intact. The decision to leave Rebecca behind nearly broke him, but her frantic gestures from across the mall's central court made it clear that staying would only result in more deaths without helping her situation. Emma's anguished cries as they fled echoed through the service corridors that Jake's military knowledge had identified as their only escape route, and the sound would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Lisa died in his arms during their desperate flight through the mall's basement levels, her final words a plea to keep the children safe that he promised to honor even though he had no idea how to fulfill it. The dawn found the survivors huddled in an abandoned warehouse 5 miles from the mall, their group reduced from 8 to 5 and their faith in human decency shattered along with their illusions about safety. Jake had taken command through necessity rather than ambition, his military training providing structure when everything else had collapsed, while Emma held the children together through sheer force of will that impressed everyone who witnessed it. The twins had withdrawn into themselves following their teacher's death, but Zoe had emerged as their protector with a fierce determination that reminded Marcus of Emma's own transformation from victim to survivor. David's betrayal had taught them that desperation could corrupt anyone, but it had also revealed the true strength of those who refused to compromise their humanity regardless of the cost. As they planned their next move, a dangerous journey toward rumors of a legitimate refugee camp in the northern mountains, Marcus realized that their group had been forged into something unbreakable through loss and betrayal. They were no longer ordinary people hoping for rescue. They had become the kind of leaders who could build something worth saving from the ashes of everything they'd lost. The abandoned subway tunnels beneath the city held secrets that Marcus never could have imagined, their darkness concealing a thriving network of survivors who'd transformed urban decay into humanity's last hope for organized resistance. Dr. Amanda Foster emerged from the shadows like a ghost made flesh, her once pristine CDC credentials now worn and stained but her intellect sharper than ever after months of piecing together the truth behind the infection that had destroyed civilization. She'd been tracking their group's movements through a network of hidden observers, impressed by their survival skills and moral choices in situations where most people descended into savagery or despair. The underground complex she led them through defied belief, a maze of repurposed maintenance areas, abandoned stations and reinforced bunkers that housed nearly 300 survivors who'd refused to accept defeat. Jake's military background had prepared him for many things, but the sophisticated operation Foster had built beneath the city's ruins challenged every assumption he'd made about post-apocalyptic survival, revealing that strategic thinking and scientific knowledge could triumph over brute force when properly organized. The Resistance had established workshops where skilled craftsmen converted salvaged materials into weapons and equipment, medical facilities that rivaled some hospitals, and communication centers that maintained contact with survivor enclaves across the continent. Foster's revelation about the infection's origin hit Marcus like a physical blow. It hadn't been a natural pandemic or terrorist attack, but a failed military experiment designed to create enhanced soldiers that had escaped containment and mutated beyond all recognition or control. Emma found herself assigned to a combat training unit led by former Special Forces operative Captain Sarah Williams, whose no-nonsense approach to tactical instruction transformed the angry teenager into a disciplined fighter capable of leading squads against infected hordes. The children were enrolled in what Foster called practical education, lessons that combined traditional subjects with survival skills, taught by teachers who understood that knowledge meant the difference between life and death in their transformed world. Tyler and Connor began to emerge from their shell of trauma under the patient guidance of instructors who'd lost their own families but refused to let grief consume their purpose, while Zoe's natural leadership abilities were nurtured through responsibilities that would have been unthinkable for a 10-year-old in the old world. Marcus discovered that his instinctive leadership during their desperate journey had been noticed by Foster's lieutenants, who began grooming him for command responsibilities within the Resistance's expanding operations across multiple safe zones. The underground network wasn't just about survival, it was about rebuilding civilization from the ground up, with lessons learned from humanity's greatest mistakes serving as the foundation for something better. Foster's scientific team had been working tirelessly to understand the infection's mechanisms, not just to find a cure, but to develop countermeasures that could protect future generations from similar disasters, whether natural or man-made. The training regimen that followed was brutal but transformative, pushing each member of their group beyond limits they'd never known they possessed while fostering teamwork that transcended their individual capabilities. Marcus learned that command meant balancing competing needs and personalities while maintaining focus on long-term objectives that sometimes required painful short-term sacrifices. Emma's evolution from traumatized survivor to tactical leader inspired other young people in the Resistance, proving that age meant nothing when measured against determination and courage. Jake found himself working with Foster's Strategic Planning Committee, his combat experience invaluable for designing operations that could eliminate large infected populations while minimizing risk to human life. The revelation that Rebecca was still alive came through intelligence gathered by Resistance operatives who'd infiltrated Sterling's coalition, and the rescue mission that followed became Marcus's first major command assignment within Foster's organization. Planning the operation required everything he'd learned about leadership, tactics, and the delicate balance between acceptable risk and moral obligation that defined true leadership in impossible circumstances. The mission's success not only reunited their group but demonstrated to the broader Resistance that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results when properly trained and motivated by causes greater than mere survival. As autumn turned to winter in the underground complex, Marcus realized they'd all become something none of them could have imagined 6 months earlier, not just survivors but architects of humanity's future. Emma commanded her own squad of young fighters with skill that impressed even the most experienced veterans, while the children had developed capabilities that would have seemed impossible before the world ended. Foster's vision extended far beyond mere resistance. She was building the foundation for a new society that could learn from the old world's failures while embracing its greatest achievements. The infection had taken everything they'd once considered normal, but in return had revealed that ordinary people possessed extraordinary potential when circumstances demanded they rise above themselves for something greater than individual survival. Operation Daybreak launched at precisely dawn, with Marcus leading the largest coordinated assault against infected hordes that the Resistance had ever attempted, a three-pronged attack designed to clear the eastern corridor and establish a permanent safe zone for the growing network of survivor communities. From his position atop the abandoned water tower, he watched as nearly 500 fighters moved into position across the industrial district, their movements coordinated through hand signals and radio bursts that represented months of training and preparation under Dr. Foster's strategic guidance. Emma commanded the northern flank with a confidence that still amazed him. The terrified teenager from the gas station had evolved into a tactical leader whose squads followed her into impossible situations because they trusted her judgment completely. The infected had concentrated in massive numbers around the old manufacturing complex, drawn by some instinct that made them gather in places where human activity had once been strongest, creating a target-rich environment that also represented the greatest threat the Resistance had ever faced. Jake's Southern Assault team included many of the Resistance's most experienced fighters, but it was Rebecca's medical corps position throughout the battlefield that would prove crucial when the inevitable casualties began mounting. She trained dozens of combat medics who could perform life-saving procedures under fire, her knowledge gained from months of treating every imaginable injury in the underground complex's hospitals. The initial artillery barrage, improvised explosives created in Foster's workshops from salvaged materials, tore through the infected ranks with devastating effectiveness, But Marcus knew the real test would come when his people had to advance through the smoke and chaos to secure their objectives. Tyler and Connor Walsh, now 13 and hardened by years of survival training, operated communication equipment that kept the scattered units connected when radio transmissions became unreliable. Zoe Martinez had become the Resistance's youngest squad leader at 14, her natural intelligence and fearless determination inspiring fighters twice her age to follow her tactical innovations. The battle's turning point came when Emma's northern unit became pinned down by a massive surge of infected that threatened to overwhelm their defensive positions, forcing Marcus to make the kind of command decision that separated true leaders from those who merely held authority. His choice to commit the reserves to Emma's rescue left the center vulnerable, but it also demonstrated the kind of loyalty that inspired ordinary people to attempt extraordinary feats in service of something greater than themselves. Jake's improvised flanking maneuver through the factory's drainage system showed how military training combined with desperate creativity could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Rebecca's moment of legend came when she abandoned her protected position to reach wounded fighters trapped in the factory's main assembly area, her medical bag and unwavering courage carrying her through infected hordes that would have terrified seasoned combat veterans. The sight of their chief medical officer refusing to let anyone die alone inspired the entire resistance, turning what could have been a disorganized retreat into a coordinated advance that swept the infected from their stronghold. Emma's decision to lead a direct assault on the factory's upper floors, against explicit orders, saved dozens of lives and demonstrated the kind of battlefield initiative that marked the difference between followers and leaders. The final phase of the battle saw Marcus coordinating simultaneous advances from 3 directions while under fire from infected who'd learned to use the factory's machinery as weapons, a development that Dr. Foster's intelligence had failed to predict. His ability to adapt tactical plans in real time while maintaining unit cohesion under extreme pressure proved that leadership skills couldn't be taught. They had to be forged through experience and tested under conditions where failure meant death for everyone depending on your decisions. Jake's explosive demolition of the factory's main support structure eliminated hundreds of infected in a single coordinated blast that required split-second timing and absolute trust between units that had trained together for months. When the smoke cleared 6 hours later, the resistance had achieved something unprecedented: the complete elimination of a major infected concentration through coordinated military action, proving that organized human resistance could reclaim territory from the hordes that had dominated the landscape for years. The cost had been significant, with 37 fighters killed and twice that number wounded, but the strategic victory represented a turning point in humanity's struggle for survival. Marcus stood among his exhausted troops, watching Emma tend to wounded fighters with the same fierce protectiveness she'd once shown the children, and realized they'd all transcended their original identities to become something history would remember. The radio crackled with reports from other resistance cells across the continent, news of similar victories inspired by Operation Daybreak's success, and Marcus understood that they'd accomplished something far greater than clearing a single district. They'd proven that ordinary people could become legends when they fought for principles worth dying for, and their example would inspire others to believe that humanity's future was worth defending. 5 years after Operation Daybreak, Marcus Thompson stood on the observation deck of New Haven's Central Tower, watching the morning sun illuminate a thriving community that defied every pessimistic prediction about humanity's future in a world overrun by the infected. The settlement sprawled across nearly 20 square miles of reclaimed territory, its borders protected by sophisticated defenses that combined Dr. Foster's scientific innovations with hard-won tactical knowledge from countless battles against both infected hordes and hostile human factions. Children who'd never known the old world played in parks built on ground that had once been contested by armies of the living dead, their laughter carrying on the wind like proof that hope could triumph over the darkest circumstances imaginable. Emma Carlson, now General Carlson to the thousands of fighters she commanded across the Continental Resistance Network, had returned from her latest mission to establish a new outpost in the Western Territories, her responsibilities having evolved far beyond anything she could have imagined during those terrifying first days in the gas station. The scared teenager who'd once clung to a baseball bat now coordinated military operations across multiple states, her tactical innovations studied in academies where future leaders learned the principles of asymmetric warfare against overwhelming odds. Her arrival always drew crowds of young fighters who saw in her proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demanded they transcend their perceived limitations. The memorial wall near New Haven's main gate bore the names of everyone who died in the struggle to reclaim this territory, including Frank Kowalski, Lisa Park, and the countless others whose sacrifices had made this moment possible. Jake Morrison, now serving as New Haven's chief of security, made it a point to visit the wall every morning, his weathered face reflecting the weight of command decisions that had shaped the destiny of thousands. Rebecca Martinez had established the most advanced medical facility in the known world, her innovations in trauma surgery and infectious disease treatment saving lives across the entire survivor network, but she still remembered every patient she'd lost during those early desperate days when medical supplies consisted of whatever could be scavenged from abandoned pharmacies. Tyler and Connor Walsh had grown into remarkable young men whose technical expertise kept New Haven's communication networks functioning across vast distances, their childhood trauma transformed into a driving need to ensure that no survivor community would ever face isolation again. Zoe Martinez commanded her own district within the city, her natural leadership abilities having flourished under the guidance of adults who understood that exceptional circumstances required exceptional trust in young people's capabilities. The children who'd once needed protection had become protectors themselves, living proof that resilience could be cultivated and passed down like any other essential skill. Dr. Foster's research facility had developed countermeasures that made large-scale infected outbreaks increasingly rare, but more importantly, her work had created the scientific foundation for a new civilization that understood the delicate balance between technological advancement and environmental responsibility. The lessons learned from the old world's failures had been codified into educational curricula that ensured future generations would understand both the potential and the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. Her collaboration with survivor communities across the globe had created a network of knowledge sharing that made humanity stronger and more resilient than it had ever been before the infection. Marcus often reflected on the strange journey that had transformed a group of terrified refugees into the founding legends of humanity's rebirth, understanding now that heroism wasn't something people were born with but rather something they discovered when faced with impossible choices that revealed their true character. The gas station where their story began had been converted into a monument and museum, its exhibits telling the story of how ordinary people had refused to surrender to despair when everything they'd known was destroyed. School children from across the survivor network made pilgrimages to see the place where Marcus Thompson, Emma Carlson, Rebecca Martinez, and their companions had made the decision to fight rather than merely survive. The radio networks that connected New Haven to dozens of other communities carried reports of new settlements being established using the principles and techniques pioneered by the resistance movement, proof that their example had inspired others to believe that rebuilding was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Marcus knew that their individual stories had become part of something larger, a testament to the idea that ordinary people possessed extraordinary potential when they fought for causes greater than themselves. As evening fell over New Haven, the lights of a thriving community pushed back the darkness that had once seemed absolute, and Marcus understood that they had achieved something far more important than mere survival. They had proven that hope, properly cultivated and fiercely defended, could literally transform the world.